Hey book besties, welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I'd wrap up the books that I read in January of 2025. First reading wrap up of the year. And I'm really excited because we got some different things going on this time around. I'm gonna start off with a couple of statistics and things like that. And then I will go into giving a brief review of each book as I usually do. So if you don't want to hear about the statistics, just skip on through this first part of the video. And if not, let's get going. All right, so in January, I read 17 books, which totaled to 4,786 pages. I thought I was going to read more than that, but that's okay. I only DNF'd one book, and that was Sour Candy. I don't know the author, but I'll put him right here. I started reading this book, and then I was just like, oh no, I can't. And then like I said, I read over 4,000 pages, and from that, the large majority of the books were less than 300 pages, and that makes sense because I had my reading blog where I read short books to kickstart my Goodreads goal, and it turns out without that video, I would have not read that much this month, which is kind of spooky, but January had like 74 days in it. It was truly the struggle. Like, I don't know how I got through it. But then 41% of the books were between 300 and 499 pages. So I feel like I had a decent mix of like normal sized books and small books. 100% of the books I read were fiction. Woo! I meant to read at least one nonfiction a month, but that didn't happen in January, and that's okay. We'll get two in February, make up for it. I mostly read medium-paced books with about 41% of fast-paced books, which means that I did not read any slow books at all, and that's okay with me. I don't think I tend to enjoy slow books, but also I'm getting through my physical TBR and lots of the books that are sent to me through book subscription boxes. So I feel like this is more representation of what Fairy Illumicrate, Afterlight, those type of book boxes tend to send, as opposed to my personal preference. Even though that kind of aligns though, I think. I'm not sure. My most read genre was horror, which surprises me, but then again, maybe not. I don't think that January is going to be like a good representation of what I prefer and my preferences. Again, because of the TBR, but also I did Winterween, which is spooky books, a readathon where you read spooky books. And then I also, all of the short books that I read for my reading short books vlog were mostly horror books as well, horror novellas. So that accounts for that. And then my lowest read is mystery and young adult, which makes sense. I feel like I don't tend to reach for young adult. I also don't think I have many left on my shelf right now. So this is going to probably be pretty consistent for a while. Mystery, I am surprised though, especially because my thriller is pretty up there on the statistics. My average rating, My average rating was 3.53 stars. I have a goal to make this 3.9 by the end of the year. So I'm really hoping that once I get through the physical TBR, that I will start to pick books more strategically than what I'm doing right now. But I don't think 3.53 is bad. I think 3 stars is like a book that I enjoyed. So having more than that is good for me. And I think my average rating in 2024 was like 3.43. So I am a little bit higher already than what I was last year. But I tend to rate books 3 stars, and that's like my go-to rating. I feel like when I liked a book but I didn't love it, is just 3. I'm kind of getting into the 0.5s, 0.75 this year because I started using Storygraph, so we'll see how that changes things. And then something I found interesting is that my average days to finish a book is 3 days. I thought it was gonna be a little bit more than that. I generally tend to say that if a book takes me more than 2 days, I'm not enjoying it. So it's interesting that my average is 3 days. That's probably those books that were 2 stars. Phoenix Keeper, looking at you. It probably took me a significant amount of time to get through those books that I wasn't enjoying, and then kind of averaged out to 3 days. We'll see what happens in January. In February, thus far, my average days read in February is 7 days, which there's not, 7 days haven't passed in the month, but I guess since I started all of these books in the previous month, I don't necessarily care whether this is a big number or a small number, but given that I have a really lofty reading goal for the year, my Goodreads goal, I probably should try to stick to like the 3 days. We will see. Also, how cute is my little journal statistic page? So cute! All right, let's move on to these ratings. So the first book that I read in January was I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. I read this on my Kindle. Basically, this book is about a girl who lives in a bunker underground with 39 other women. They're locked up there, and she, because she's the youngest one and has been raised pretty much her entire life in this bunker, she has never met men. It's only these women. And this book kind of follows, I feel like I can't say without ruining the book. Essentially, you're just trying to figure out what's going on here. I ended up giving this 4 stars. This book had me so flipping pensive. At first, I was a little bit bored, but I was definitely hooked to find out what is going on here. Why are these women down here? What's the reason? And I feel like I left reading this book thinking so differently about time, about distance, about age. My ring light died. All right, we're back in business. Hopefully my camera doesn't die too. Okay, so yeah, basically I was just thinking about so many things so differently because this book paints it in like a different perspective. You really get to see how all of those things are just subjective. They're very man-made. They're very open to like what we interpret them to be throughout this book. And so I just felt like my mind was blown, and I really had to sit and think like, what did I just read? Then I read Graveyard Shift. This book is basically about, I think it's 6 strangers, and they tend to meet up every night at this graveyard where they take their smoke break or something like that, and then one day they come to meet up and take their break, and there's like a empty grave dug up, and they're kind of figuring out, why is this here, what's going on. I really loved the vibe and ambiance of this book, and so that pretty much gave it like the rating that I gave it, which was 3 stars. Especially the second chapter. I wish we had gotten more of the second chapter. But besides that, I feel like a large portion of this book went right over my head. I did enjoy it, but when I looked it up at the end and Googled an explanation for the ending, I realized that there were a lot of little details and things that I missed as I was reading the book. So that's not a good sign, Adriana. I mean, I think the book was meant to be ominous, but I was really just confused. Overall, the resolution, I wish that we had more information about it because I was interested in that. That would have definitely hooked me a little bit more, but it was good for a short book. The next book I read was The Grown Up. This was unplanned, and holy guacamole, this was probably one of the best books that I read this month. The Grown Up is essentially about this woman who works at a shop where they do psychic readings, and in the back, they give happy endings. And so one day, this woman walks into the shop, and the main character sees that she's rich. She thinks she's gonna swindle her, and they become friendly, and she comes over to this woman's house to get rid of a spirit or something that the woman says that she has. And things start to go awry. It's kind of giving like haunted house vibes. Overall, I was hooked. on this book from the very first, like the very first sentence of this book is bananas. And it does not get any less bananas as you read it. I highly recommend it, and it is a quick read too. So you can get through it pretty quickly. I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. The next book I read was What Moves the Dead, and I don't remember the main characters' names for a lot of these books. I don't remember a lot of this book either. Now that I'm looking back on it, it's just not standing out to me, but essentially the main character goes to the home of one of their friends, and she has fallen ill, so he shows up to go visit her, and things are just not what they seem. Again, another haunted type vibe book. One thing that really stood out to me about this book is how much the main character hates Americans. I thought it was so funny. It was like repeated so many times and was like a pretty big part of the main character's personality, and that was just funny, but that's a total aside. The thing that I love the most about this book is the fact that even though it was a short book, somehow the author does a really good job of setting up the lore, the setting, the background for these characters. It's kind of woven throughout the story in a way that I don't think I've seen a book do that well, I feel personally, especially given how little pages we have. And I read the second book in this series, which was called What Feasts at Night, and you get even more lore in that book than you do in the first one. What Moves the Dead, I gave 4 stars because I really enjoyed the writing. I felt like there's this one scene where this girl smiles and she transforms, and that lives rent-free in my brain. That is the one scene that will stick in my head about this book forever. And yeah, it was just well written. I loved the writing style of this book, and even though some of the parts were maybe not the most interesting, I think the way that the author wrote it definitely had me more interested than I would have been had this been written a different way. I feel like that's like a duh, but I don't know how to make sense of what I'm trying to say. The only thing that kind of put this down from a 5 stars to a 4 stars to me is that the ending dragged a little bit, where I felt like we had a resolution, but the story kept going, which is odd given how short this book is. But other than that, I had no qualms. I loved the vibes. And that is exactly why I read the second book, What Feasts at Night. This one I gave 3 stars. There was a lot going on with like the lore, and we switched into using these pronouns based on the lore of, I don't know what Galatia is, a country, the country of Galatia. It's like the fictional place where this takes place. So the main character from book 1, he returns to his homeland to do a favor for a character in the first book, and when he gets to his home, he finds his home housekeeper unalive. And again, I really enjoyed the eerie vibes. I liked the story and the reveal of what was kind of torturing or whatever these characters. I think it's not necessarily a spoiler to talk about these things. In both the first and the second book, it's pretty obvious from the beginning what it is that's tormenting these characters, and you just kind of are in for the ride, you know, not necessarily a reveal, even though the characters kind of take some time to get to the final realization of what's going on. Anyways, I was just overall pretty distracted by just trying to figure out the different pronouns, because they have pronouns for not only just people, but like based on their occupation as well. There's a pronoun for God, there's a pronoun for objects. It was a lot. Next, I read Galatia by Madeline Miller, and I also gave this 4.5 stars. I was obsessed. This was very different, I think, than what I was expecting from her. Essentially, this follows Pygmalion and Galatia. So Pygmalion is an artist, and he makes a sculpture of a perfect woman. He pleads to a god for her to become real, and she does grant him this wish. And then he's married to Galatia, and he kind of has this control over her, that it overtakes him, this control that he has to have over her. And I really love the personifications, how they relate to Stone, and just Madeline Miller's writing in general was just so chef's kiss, beautiful. I had a good time. It was short, it was quick, it was good, it was interesting. It ended totally unexpectedly, a little bit abrupt, but I had a good time. And then I read The Yellow Wallpaper, which is technically a short story. This is about a woman whose husband brings her out to a home away from home for her to rest because she was going bananas after giving birth. Except that obviously having her locked up to like have like the rest cure is making her see things in the wallpaper. She starts to believe that there's a woman stuck inside the wallpaper. I gave this 2 stars just because I feel like I remembered it being a lot more interesting when I read it in grad school than I did this time around. I don't have much to say about that other, like, that's it. Like, nothing really happens. So then I read For She Is Wrath by Emily Varga, and in this book, our main character essentially is locked up in prison, and she is there for something that she didn't do. She was framed by the love of her life, who betrayed her, and she's out for revenge. I ended up giving this 3 stars. Like, we were so close to being at like a 2-star. I felt like the fact that she was out for revenge, it was just repeated so much throughout the book that it was getting a little bit tiring and annoying, to be honest. I also just can't relate because like I don't feel that in my heart. Like a need for retaliation and things like that. So I just kind of didn't click with the motivation of the character in this book. I do think that the magic system was pretty interesting. There's like this stuff with seeds going on. It was a little bit inconsistent, the magic system, I'm not gonna lie. Maybe not necessarily the magic system itself, but the character and the way she would think. So for example, she would say to her friend would tell her that she's nervous, and she'd be like, don't be nervous, you have me, we're gonna be fine. And then at the end she's like, yeah, well, maybe she's not nervous, but I am. And it's like, girl, she literally just told you she was nervous. What are you talking about? Like, you think because you told her not to be, she's all of a sudden not? It just little things like that just were not clicking and making sense. And they're such minute details, but I was like so stuck on them, and there was a few of them. So, you know, anyways. The next book I read is The Courting of Bristol Keats by Mary E. Pierce. This is basically about a girl named Bristol, and her father is unalived. He passes away somehow. But then after some time has passed, she realizes that there's the potential that her father actually hasn't passed away and he could still be alive. And so she goes out to find him, and she finds herself in the world of the Fae. So she makes this bargain with the king of the Fae, Teigen. But what she doesn't know is that Teigen could be the reason that her father was driven away in the first place. Honestly, this book, first of all, is gorgeous. I gave it 4 stars. I was literally so intrigued by the world building. The magic and the world kind of reminded me of The Cruel Prince, and maybe that's why I loved it so much, because I am obsessed with the Cruel Prince series. I wish I could read it again for the first time. This was like a much longer version of that, and also it felt a little bit more adult, I want to say. We went 65 chapters in this book too without spice, and then suddenly we had spice, and it was just very upsetting to me because y'all know I don't like that. I also didn't think I was gonna like this because I didn't like the previous series that I read by this author, but this is a totally different vibe from Dance of Thieves. So I'm excited that I did enjoy it. I think the only thing that I didn't enjoy besides the spice was the ending, but there was still enough suspense in it whereas I will definitely read the second book, and this is supposed to be a duology, so I'm excited that it's gonna end there, you know, because these are chunky monkeys. I cannot get myself into another 5 to 8 book series because I'm in the middle of like 3 right now. It's really intense, but I loved this, and I can't wait for book 2 to come out at the end of this year. Then I read Alice in Borderland Volume 8, and I'm just going to chunk this in with Volume 9 as well, so I don't have to talk about it twice. Basically, Alice in Borderland, it's about these people, they're in Tokyo, all of a sudden they see this bright light, and then they find themselves in like Tokyo, but without like any people. They're like, what's going on here? They end up finding out that they're in some kind of alternate reality, different world. Like, we don't know what it is or where they are exactly throughout the series. However, they have to essentially play these games, and if they win the game, they get like days added to their visas. If your visa runs out, you get unalived. So you should probably win some games. And Volume 8, I gave 3 stars simply because I felt like we weren't following the main character in this volume. And so even though that makes logical sense, it's not possible for the main character to clear all of the games when there's literally hundreds of people in here. However, I just wasn't as interested when it wasn't about the main character. Like, I was really invested in his story, but I guess I didn't realize how invested I was until he was not in this volume. The games themselves were really interesting here, but I feel like they did get less interesting progressively over time. I mean, they were bananas in the beginning, like literally blew my marbles. So it's not that this book was bad at all. It just wasn't like, it wasn't what the first book was. That being said, book 9, I gave a 4 stars because y'all gotta watch that vlog. I was on a roller coaster of emotions, and the game that they play in that book, it could have been the simplest, most boring game, but the way that they mess with your mind, it was bonkers. I highly, highly, highly recommend this series. Even though I gave Volume 9 4 stars, as a series as a whole, I would say this is a 5-star series for me. Then I read Adrift in Currents, Clean and Clear. This is a book 10 of the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. In this book, one of our beloved characters, Nadia, goes on her journey to a different world. Essentially, in this series, we're following a bunch of children who do the things that kids do in fantasy movies. They find worlds in the back of a wardrobe or under a lake, or they walk through a door and find themselves in a different world, and then they eventually come back to our world and they've lived a whole life but come back, and now they have to be children, and they're kind of dealing with that. So in this one, we get the story of Nadia's voyage to her world, which I don't remember now what it's called. So Nadia gets adopted and brought to America, and she was born without one of her arms. She's never felt incomplete because you can't miss what you never had. However, her adoptive parents, in an attempt to be like perfect and show off that they're such good people to this adopted daughter that they have, they get her prosthetic arm that they kind of force on her, even though she doesn't want it. And so she runs away and finds herself in this magical world with lakes and turtles, and it has a lot to do with water. And one of my favorite things that Seanan McGuire does is that she uses metaphors that are strongly related to the world that you're in. So a lot of the metaphors here had to do with turtles, with water, with lakes and things like that. And I love that she just pulls you into the world. And this is why I love her writing, and I love these books and these series specifically. However, I think that this wasn't one of my favorites in the entire series, so I ended up giving this 3 stars. Then I read We Used to Live Here by Marcus Keeler. Another book that just blew my mind. Basically, this one is about this man, and he shows up to this couple's house and he's like, hey, I used to live here. Can I show my family around the house? And Charlie and Eve, they just moved into this house and they're like, all right, come on in. And then the youngest daughter of this man goes missing and things start to turn out weird and things are just not right. And we kind of go out into this like downward spiral of this gets crazier and crazier and crazier as the story goes on. That's all I can say. I gave it 4 stars because I was like having nightmares. My heart was palpitating. This was a really good book in terms of like, it did what thrillers need to do. You know what I mean? It kept me on the edge of my seat. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars is because the ending really threw me off. There was just no real explanation for why things were suddenly stable in the way that they were. And it also just felt completely different, like a completely different vibe than what the large majority of the book was. So that kind of took me out of the story. But besides that, it was really, really good. I'm so happy I read this book. And going with the theme of spooky books, because this was for my Winterween vlog, I read The Book of Witching by C.J. Cook. Basically, this followed 2 timelines. The first one is Clem. She is Erin's mom, and she gets a phone call that Erin is in the hospital after a hiking trip with her friends. And Erin wakes up from a coma, and she is now saying, why are you calling me Erin? I'm not Erin. My name is Nyx. And so Clem is like, what's going on? And she is trying to get to the bottom of what happened on this hiking trip. Did something more nefarious happen? Does it have to do with some witchy things? Or is this just a symptom of her getting hit in the head or something? The second timeline is this witch back in the past. She is the first person to have been executed due to witchcraft. And I thought it was really interesting that this is supposedly based on something real, or at least one timeline of this is. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I gave it 3 stars. I just felt like one timeline, it took the entirety of the book to play out. So like literally the summary at the back of the book took the entire book basically to play out. And then the second timeline was where we really got a lot more of the information. And it certainly was interesting, but I wish we had a lot more details about like the witchiness, what they were actually doing, what these characters were getting into. Just to, you know, I just wanted a little bit more, and I didn't want more pages. I wanted those descriptions in the pages we already have. You know, like it's not that this book wasn't long enough. I just needed more details. Then I read The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This book is essentially about a couple and their daughter go out to a cabin for vacation, and while their daughter is playing outside, this random dude comes up to her and he's like, hey, I came to let you know that we're going to be knocking on the door of your cabin, and I'm going to need you to convince your dads to let us in. They're not going to want to let us in, but you need to tell them that they need to let us in. Overall, the essential premise of the book is that these people are saying that the world is coming to an end, like there's like a big apocalypse, and the only way to stop it is for the family to sacrifice one of themselves. So it's kind of like a choose your family or choose the world type of situation. I liked the apocalyptic vibes. I liked like the impending doom. I liked that we're intrigued about whether this is real or not. Are these people having a shared delusion or what the heck is going on here? I definitely was throughout the entirety of the book interested in just trying to find out what is the truth here. He definitely leaves you little breadcrumbs where you're questioning whether it is or it's not. But overall, I think the vibes were just like good, not great, you know? Then I read The Phoenix Keeper by S.A. McLean, and this book is essentially about a girl who is a phoenix keeper at a zoo for magical creatures. And she has this impending threat of someone maybe poaching the phoenix eggs in her program, and that is honestly pretty much the entirety of the synopsis of this book. It's pretty chunky for like such a short synopsis, but when I tell you that barely anything else happens, this is one of those like cozy fantasy books where they kind of list mundane tasks. Think Legends and Lattes. The description of this said Legends and Lattes meets The House in the Cerulean Sea, but I think that there's literally nothing of this really gives like The House in the Cerulean Sea, except for like nothing. I don't know why they would say that. That's one of my favorite books of all time, and I ended up giving this book 2 stars just because it is just not my type of book. I don't think it was poorly written or anything. I just don't typically like those kind of listy type books. I do think if you liked Legends and Lattes, you would enjoy this for sure. I think I also gave Legends and Lattes 2 stars. And then the last book, For the Last Time in... What? I Did Something Bad by Faye Mautetouar. This book is about a girl who gets an opportunity to do an interview for Vogue Singapore and basically shadow this really famous and rich actor, Tyler Toon. So she shadows him so she can write this interview, and while she's doing that, she and Tyler find themselves hiding an unalive body and covering up and unaliving. Can you say the M word on the internet? I never know. Anyways, throughout the process of that, they find themselves falling for each other. This is a romance book. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. I really enjoyed the premise of the book. However, I feel like there was so much opportunity for like those like near caught moments, and we had a few of them, but I would have wanted a lot more to kind of keep you on the edge of your seat. The other thing that kind of turned me off about this book is like the description of the main character. She literally says he smells like a tree, describes his lips as like dry ridges. Gross. Yeah, let that sink in. And then he tastes like red beans and egg tart. I don't know what a red bean and egg tart tastes like. However, when I think about kissing someone, I do not want to think about beans and eggs. Like, that makes me think of farts. Is it just me? So I did enjoy this book, but there was just some like questionable choices in it overall. And that was it, y'all. That was all 17 books. If you made it this far, leave me a pen emoji for our journalist main character and I Did Something Bad. If you enjoyed this, make sure you hit that like button. And if you want to join the family, hit that subscribe button. I will see you all when I see you next. Bye.